A quick intro, and then hopefully we'll get the mic situation. We are filming this, which is one of the reasons we want the mic, so we can make sure that on video you can hear it really well. So welcome, I'm Jennifer Player. I'm the CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Orange County. I'm so glad you're here for our third and final installment of our Home is the Key speaker series. We've had one conversation on healthcare, one conversation on education, and tonight we're going to be talking about economic mobility. So welcome. Our sponsor tonight could not be here. This is First National Bank out of Hillsborough, and they have graciously underwritten the food and rental costs of the event and wine so that we could be here to enjoy this lovely conversation. So if you know someone from First National, since they're not here tonight, say thank you on our behalf for sponsoring this event. So tonight we're going to talk about the American dream. So this idea that regardless of where you're born, that you can climb the economic ladder, the income ladder, and you can achieve success. That is the American dream that we all know, that we talk about. The idea that regardless of where you're born or the situation you're born into, that you can rise above that, that you might be able to break through cycles of poverty possibly that have been in your family for generations. And I don't know if you all are familiar with Harvard economist Raj Shetty, who's done really some landmark work recently on economic mobility, and has found through his research that in the 1940s, kids who were born in the 1940s had a 90% chance of doing better than their parents, of improving their situation above where their parents were. And today, his research has found that number is only 50%. So it's more and more difficult to, if you're born into poverty, to move out of poverty. So that's what we're going to discuss tonight. We're going to discuss the intersection of housing and economic mobility with our great panelists here. And like I said, we are filming this. We have the other two panels filmed as well. So if you're interested, we'll be sending out a YouTube link so that you can check those out if you want and forward them on to all of your friends. So I know there's a basketball game that starts in 23 minutes, so we're going to get this started. I do want to introduce Holly Fracaro, who's our moderator tonight. You may know Holly through her work as the Chief Executive Officer for the Home Builders Association of Durham, Orange, and Chatham counties. Before joining the HBA in 2013, Holly actually worked as an affordable housing developer in the Chicago area, so she knows this topic very well. So you can read more about Holly on your handout, but otherwise I'm going to pass it over to Holly, and thank you for agreeing to serve in this role tonight.
Thank you. I was really honored. We're talking to the mic now. Can you hear me? I was honored to say yes to Jennifer when she asked me to moderate this. I am very passionate about affordable housing, and I think that this is a really important conversation, and thank you for thinking of this in this final series of Home is the Key to discuss, and today we're going to discuss the relationship of stable housing and an individual's ability to thrive in the world, and that's really what we all want, right? To thrive in the world with which we live. So before we begin, I want to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
I am Samuel Gunter. I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Housing Coalition. We are the statewide affordable housing advocacy group with members who are advocates, professionals across the state who do this work. I've previously worked at a Habitat affiliate, and before that I was a pastor.
Thank you. I'm Ian Buchanan. I'm President for Ambulatory and Post-Acute Services for UNC Healthcare statewide, and before that I spent about 10 years at UNC Hospitals running a wide variety of operations there.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Creighton Blackwell. I am Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Community Engagement at Coastal Credit Union. Also the current chair of the board for the Greater Chapel Hill Carrboro Chamber of Commerce. Also, I'm the current chair of the North Carolina Council on Economic Education, as well as North Carolina Jumpstart, former board member of the Habitat in Wake. This has been a conversation I've been probably a part of for the 22 years that I have been in the financial industry.
Thank you, gentlemen. We did also have a homeowner that was going to be with us today, but she's not feeling well. So when appropriate, I might just throw in the question and some of what we believe she would say if she were asked that. Samuel, let's start with you, and I'm going to ask that you help us set the stage and provide some context on research related to the connection of economic mobility and housing. What statistics do you see both nationally and locally?
Yeah. So we mentioned Raj Chetty before, and I think anyone who's familiar with that work, anyone who does this work, the work that's been done there is kind of foundational to how we think about this, right? Place matters. That's one of the things that we've over tracking folks and tracking economic mobility through the years. Place matters. Where you live matters. Not just your house, it's your zip code, right? Who are you close to? What kind of opportunities you're exposed to? And where your parents are. It dictates a lot, and it's surprising how much it dictates, given the narrative that we have that we started off with, that doesn't matter what you're born into, you can do great things, right? When the reality is, probably what you're born into has quite a bit of bearing on what you're going to be, and the horizon of possibilities in the future. There's a number of ways to think about that, particularly the statistic that for folks born in the 1940s, there was a 90% chance that they were going to be better off than their parents, versus folks today that it's more 50%. And I think about, it's hard to think about this in terms other than your own story. And so one of the ways that I think through this story is tracking my granddad, right? World War II vet, came back home. He's from a poor rural white family in Central Florida. Came back home from the war and used the GI Bill to go to college and then to law school, right? Bought his home, was a very successful legal practice over the course of his years. And his kids were born in a much better situation than he was, which set us up for something else. And my dad was a pastor of small rural Baptist churches in Tennessee and Kentucky and Texas, and so not a lot of great income. But when times got rough for my family, my granddad was pretty well off and could help out. When we had to switch churches and the house was it was a downturn in the market, house wasn't worth much, it could have been financially devastating for our family. He helped us weather that storm until we got back on our financial feet, which set me up to be at a place to get out of undergrad without any debt, right? It sets you up for something when your family comes from something. So when I think about things like economic engines like the GI Bill was, and think about the life of the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and talk about race, right? That the GI Bill for many families like mine, it was available, but the GI Bill was a locally administrated program. A lot of black veterans coming back from World War II didn't have access to the GI Bill. Same experience in the war, well, not the same experience in the war, but veterans of the war didn't have the same access to a program that drove a lot of the economic mobility that we saw in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Locked out of home ownership, which for many low and moderate income families throughout the course of the last half century has been the main accumulator of equity, of wealth, right? And when you're locked out of that in many ways, it becomes a challenge. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. And I think the statistic for me, and kind of this being the Habitat Speaker Series, is the homeownership statistic, particularly among African-American families in this country. After the war, after World War II, the homeownership rate in the nation was right around 44, 45%, so hovering right around there. You fast forward to today, we're in the mid-60s, but the homeownership rate among black families in our country is at the same level it was after World War II. Place matters, the family you come out of matters, the systems that we interact with matter for economic mobility.
Wow, that is some great stage setting. Thank you so much. Creighton, I want to move on to you. In your work at Coastal and the 2 decades of work and involvement with communities and affordable housing, what are the various ways housing, and specifically home ownership, can impact a person's ability to climb the income ladder?
I will go a couple of different ways on this. One of the things, and when you talk about impact, it's not just about getting in homes, it's also about staying in homes. And how do you really look at that holistically? One of the things I've always questioned in a lot of these conversations is how we kind of piecemeal this. And we put it in different segments instead of being able to look at it holistically. Because when you're looking at this, it's not just about that home, it's also about, what about daycare? How is that gonna happen? How is getting this home? What about the taxes in specific areas? When we talk about the differences as to where you are and how that tax base may be completely different, less than 5 miles down the road from here to somewhere else. How are you looking at all those expenses? How are you now looking at the ability to purchase certain types of foods there? What are the grocery store? Is there a food desert there? All of these different factors come into play when it still comes back to, so is this truly affordable or not? It's interesting to us how the definitions of affordable housing is still something that people are trying to grasp, and they continue to redefine it. I was at a debate the other day where I was talking with someone about the difference in housing affordability and affordable housing, and how many people look at those things completely different. And when you go back to, so what's the value? How's it really impacting people? If you're not looking at it holistically, then you are really now doing what we see a lot of, which is continuing to divide people into certain areas, certain groups. And a lot of this is going to still be based off of where they are from this mobility standpoint, where they are from a financial standpoint. And you're seeing not just the family, but the housing is now helping to really define that for the family in itself.
I'm going to stick with you for one more sub-question, really, because you set it up well. With your involvement in the chambers and the business community, what are the conversations with other local businesses what conversations are you having with them about trying to recruit new businesses into the area, and how does affordable housing affect a business's decision and ability to come here, hire, and retain employees?
Sure. A lot of businesses that I have conversations with when it comes to this, who are they recruiting? Because when you have so many businesses that are trying to recruit certain talent, but that talent actually can't live here. That talent is having to live on the outskirts. My father worked in Chapel Hill for 46 years, but we couldn't afford to live here. I grew up in Person County. I'll be really specific. I grew up in Hurdle Mills. It's where I grew up in Person County, which is a completely different world than what it is here. So a lot of these businesses, when they're looking at talent, when you're really looking at economic development now, and you're saying, where can I go? I'm going where I can get the talent. And if I have talent that truly has to now drive 30 to 45 minutes to even be able to get to work, or it's just some of that talent now that may be really good, is that the talent that I can keep and that I can sustain. It's much easier to be able to sustain that talent if I have a way to be able to have them here. If more of our people can live here in Chapel Hill, they'll work here. Number one, productivity. They know the statistics of productivity goes up. The fact of the matter is that now, guess what? I can get to my child's event that I needed to get to quicker. I didn't have to add another 45 minutes. Even to the point where, what about gas? And let's talk about all those expenses. As a financial professional, it's all about expenses to me, and looking at everything holistically to say, that's the value. As a business, if I'm really looking at that talent, I'm going into those conversations and saying, can I have certain wages? Living wage, I think, is a very interesting argument also, to make sure and be in programs with developers that says that I want to keep my talent here.
Absolutely, thank you. We're just going to use Creighton's microphone.
Oh, so mine works.
Yes.
Okay.
Ian, UNC Healthcare is one of our largest local employers, and continues to grow with new buildings and offices throughout the area. As an employer, what do you think is the impact of the lack of housing has on your business?
Thanks. Yeah, so I believe this probably holds true for the university as well as the health system, which is that we're fortunate in that because we represent very stable employment, particularly for lower wage earners, and we represent a very valuable benefits package, a good pension, that sort of thing. We are an employer of choice, and so that certainly helps us. Where we get, I think, really damaged by the lack of affordable housing in this area is not being able to have our employees add to the culture and the fabric of our local community, because the vast majority of our employees do not live in Chapel Hill or Carrboro. The vast majority of our employees live in Alamance County, Durham County, Person County, and Chatham County. And so when you walk through the halls of the hospital, you do see a very diverse and vibrant workforce, not just African American, not just Hispanic, but Hmong and Karen and a number of other people who perhaps are new to the United States even. But we really lose that diversity when you walk out the doors of the hospital, or you walk out the doors of the university, because all of those people have to get on a bus, ride 45 minutes to come to work. And I think it is detrimental to our community as a whole that all of that talent and all of that diversity comes into town every morning and then leaves every afternoon, and we don't get any benefit from it, culturally or economically or any other way.
And you actually sort of answered my next question, would have stuck with you, and to talk about what is the impact on our community, on the hospital and the university it's connected to, because the employees, many of whom are not able to live here, are coming and going. So you answered that well. Samuel, when you look at this issue nationally, what is one example of a policy or initiative that has been successful in addressing the lack of affordable housing as it relates to educational outcomes?
So as it relates, the housing is one of the things, almost fell off my chair, crossed my leg very vigorously. Housing is one of those, because place matters, right? Where you live ends up impacting your interaction with most of our systems, criminal justice system, educational system, and on down transportation, access to employment, on down the line, right? And because, especially this bears out in the Chetty work, educational opportunities are a key driver for economic mobility. And as you mentioned, right, your tax base. What do your schools look like? How are they funded? And if you don't have access to schools that provide you with opportunities to so on and so forth, right, that becomes a challenge. One of the things that around the country, I think everyone is dealing with on the urban side is where gentrification is out there, right? And I'm going to guess that folks in this room have heard it before, and that if I polled the room, we'd have a number of different definitions for what that word means. We've been having a lot of intense, I live in Durham, we've been having a lot of intense conversations in Durham right now about it. And what I want to say about it is the movement of where people live, right, has changed. There's kind of a narrative in our cities across the country during the 1960s, particularly after the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. We had a massive exodus of the urban core of cities around the country to the suburbs, and we had the creation of the suburbs, right? And it was kind of a racial movement, right, in one direction. And that's been happening kind of in the opposite direction recently. And places that we've historically disinvested are now ripe for development. And that interaction has seen a lot of conflict. Neighborhoods are changing. Folks are getting priced out of places that were historically, right, that becomes a challenge. And so around the country, folks have been trying to figure out how to get the kind of mix that you're talking about. How do we get mixed income developments in a way that where you've got the folks at the CEO level and the folks who are at the janitorial level in a relatively close proximity because they're all part of the same community working at the same places. And it's rough out there, y'all. It's hard to do that. And one of the reasons that it's hard to do that is because we have built our cities in a particular way and zoned them in a particular way that change is really hard, right? I think about Habitat Wake trying to build in Cary. Last year? Was that last year? That was only last year. It's only been a year. And you got a plot of land in Cary next to homes that are probably about 250,000 at the time. They were about 250, 300,000, and you're wanting to build a neighborhood of Habitat townhomes, and the adjacent neighborhood lost their mind about property values, right? And in some of those public hearings, some of the things that I heard from folks, someone asked a question whether or not they could guarantee the folks that lived in those houses wouldn't have any more children. And what? What kind of a question is that, man? It's a challenge, right? And it's a challenge because we have built our geography in a particular way to certain policy ends. And we've seen the result of that, right? And now folks are trying to change, and it's hard because it's in our streets. It's in the way that we've built our physical geography. And so folks have, in Charlotte, Renaissance West Community Initiatives was a place-based solution where you tried to get education system, healthcare system, public safety, affordable housing developers to think holistically about an entire neighborhood, right? And we've seen some success in models like that, but those models are hard to come by because they're expensive, they take a lot of time, you're trying to manage partners and work outside of silos, and there's a reason we're in silos in the first place, because this stuff is complicated. So there are things happening around the country, but they're happening in pockets.
You really set me up really well for the next question, and it's really, we were speaking before we started about some of the ventures and activities that Orange County Habitat is embarking on, and one of those is that exact thing, and they're looking at a large piece of property where they intend and will do mixed income housing. And there is a lot of research about how the kids who grew up in mixed income neighborhoods fare significantly better than kids who grew up in neighborhoods where there is less income diversity. And in those families that we're studying, the incomes are the same, right? So this place matters, the zip code matters. It's good to live next to a doctor when you're a janitor, whatever the case may be. In my case, my mother was a single teacher and we lived next to the dentist. And that was great. I played a lot of Nintendo over at that kid's house. So Creighton, sorry. Creighton, with your diverse background in community development and affordable housing, I would like to have you riff on this a little bit. And then Ian, I would like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
So as we were listening to this too, it seems to me it's difficult to ignore kind of a history of how we have put priority in value, in certain value of real estate. Right? And in certain ways that we have looked at the home and where it is. So much of what we are dealing with now, there was a few years ago that one of the jobs I had is I was going across the state to different municipalities, and I was trying to get the state to be able to build more small business loan pools. Because at the time, some of the banks had started losing a little bit of their risk tolerance. They didn't want to do very much, and we were going around saying, okay, so what if you built these things up? And actually you gave these small business loans out to really kind of spur some entrepreneurship. Well, every one of these programs and everyone I talked to also had some form of downtown revitalization program. And part of every one of those programs was this question about, if we're going to rebuild this downtown, who do we want? And if we want a certain target, literally, and target came into some of these, but we want to be able to say, if we want to build a new base and we want to attract people, we wanted to attract certain targets. We wanted to put a value and a priority on who we're going to bring in. And that's when I think we started seeing an explosion of a lot of outside investing that's coming in and purchasing land and purchasing plots and rebuilding those. And now you get into your gentrification type discussions, and you get into where people are going and who you wanted to really be a part of this. As you see people get pushed out, you saw lives change. Because now they don't have certain access to different things. Now you are uprooting entire, we have people here, we look at Northside here in this area. We see how some of that has changed. A lot of outside investments coming in for student housing purposes and buying that. Those people that moved, their lives have now changed. The ability to be able to keep people where they are and also now have an increased value to, you know something, there is a lot of power in having those two different segments. The doctor, the janitor, all there together. It just doesn't need to be necessarily 15 doctors. And let that be it. And a belief.
It's too many doctors.
I don't want to live in that neighborhood.
And it's interesting how there's a piece of all of us saying, we will help change that narrative. We will actually be able to take some of our ego out of the real estate and out of the value that we're putting in home ownership in certain areas, and certain development, to be able to really say, okay, no, let's give everyone kind of this same general type of lifestyle that everyone else has.
I don't remember what the question was, but I'm just going to go back to sort of the theme of it. As a large employer and also as a provider of healthcare, I think this concept that people are uprooted and pushed farther out of the city center, to take again our many of our employees who live in less densely populated areas, so they may very well be food deserts. But the other thing they frequently are is healthcare deserts. Because once you get out of major metropolitan areas, particularly in North Carolina, we have a dramatic shortage of healthcare services and healthcare providers. And so it represents sort of a structural disadvantage to people who oftentimes also have limited transportation options. They can't just hop in the car the way I do this morning and drive somewhere. And so even if as an employer, even if we're providing them good health insurance, they can have the same health insurance I do. But if they live 20 miles out in Alamance County and there's not easy to access health care around them, they're probably going to make other decisions about how to spend their limited time, their limited transportation money, and all too often it'll be at the neglect of their own health or the health of their family, although typically not their children. It's incredible the extent to which people will go to get care for their children. But the larger piece, I think that just speaks to the double whammy, triple whammy, quadruple whammy when you move when you move lower income populations out of city centers and out of more urban areas into areas where the same level of infrastructure doesn't exist and is harder to access, and they got to rely on the Quickie Mart for their groceries, and they got to rely on whatever. I think that's just another challenge and another compelling reason why collectively we've got to come to a solution so that people can live together and so that people can live closer to where they work and where they play and where they have their community.
And I just want to add one other thing to that, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head on investment, right? Your house is a lot of things. It's your home, it's where but it is also, for many people, an investment vehicle, which creates a problem, right? Which means this thing that is absolutely necessary for all of us to have and is critical is also this thing that people make incredible amounts of money investing in, which means we get crazy prices. I was telling, before this started, that my wife and I bought our home in Durham, our first home in Durham. We found out we were pregnant with our first child the day we closed on the house. And we had started looking just as Durham was about to go crazy, and realized we couldn't buy in the city unless it needed a ton of work, and that's not what we were about. And so we went north. So we're in far north Durham, well outside of the area that we'd initially considered. And now I've got 1-year-old twins and a 3-year-old. And my wife and I both commute to Raleigh. And so putting all those kids in daycare and with the commute, our life is insane right now, y'all. And housing costs, we need to have another one of these about daycare costs because it's out of control, people. But so we have this question, should we move to make our, should we move to Raleigh? But where housing prices are at right now, it's really twice the cost of what we paid to move anywhere, right? That fits us. And so you make some pretty tough decisions as a family about all of that. And we're fortunate we both have jobs that pay us pretty well. And so we can make certain decisions. But the other connection here to education, and we've seen this in a number of places, and evictions have become a big conversation point. When you fall off the edge of the rental map into an eviction, particularly in a hot rental market, when you got 40 people queuing up for a place, why on earth would you want to rent to someone who has an eviction on their record, right? And when you're at some of the lower incomes and month to month, one emergency becomes a catastrophe, and you get pushed out of wherever you are, it's really hard to find a place. And so you begin this journey further and further down the standard of housing to slumlord. Or as we saw in Raleigh a number of years ago with the Raleigh motel fire, you start living in a motel and paying significantly more a month to live in that one room in a hotel than you would for an apartment, but you can't put together a security deposit or no one will rent to you because you have an eviction on your record. One of the consequences of that for education is you move kids. Your kids are moving around. The bus doesn't know where to pick them up. Depending on how you organize your school system, you got to start at a whole new school now. It becomes incredibly disruptive for a child at a very key stage of development. And so this connection for folks with housing stability, in particular in education, is pretty critical.
Yeah, you guys are just answering the questions without me.
I can't help but also mention too, when you talk about, you might have to make a different choice on what you decide you need to pay on. When you look at your whole slate of different debts and different bills, so how does that affect your credit?
Yeah.
Right? So then your credit is impacted, and then you have lots of lenders in lots of other areas that when that happens, now you need another loan, your credit is worse, your interest rate goes up. Right? So now that's even more money that you're having to pay. If it's depending on your scores and how they're impacted, you can get the loan at all. Or do you now have to go to another type lender, and now instead of it being a 6% loan, you're now paying 28%. That's real dollars that turns into. So now we're talking about, once again, how are you making all of these decisions to figure out how am I paying for transportation? What's the health care? Do I actually take this medicine and buy this medicine this month? Because I need to get to work because I'm 30 to 45 miles out. Like, these are real situations of people through many different income levels are having to face every day.
So yesterday was an election day, and we all watched the elections very closely. And so as we wrap up, I'm going to ask this question to all of you. We'll start with Samuel. If there's one thing that you could say to an elected official and policymakers to get them to pay more attention to housing, and I think a lot of these other just socioeconomic issues, what would it be? In what should we say, 5 minutes or less, each of you?
We should close with Samuel on this.
Well,
He's got the preacher in him.
Yeah, well, I'll say I spend a lot of time in the General Assembly, right? I do a lot of state legislative work. Yeah, I know. It's, I want them to go home so bad. They want to go home too. That's, so I spend a lot of time talking to legislators. Frankly, for the last several years, because we've had supermajorities of Republicans, I spend a lot of time talking to Republicans. And a lot of time talking to rural Republicans, in particular, who generally have seen affordable housing as a big city issue, not their problem. And so it doesn't really raise to the priority of we need to do something about this at a significant scale on the statewide level. That changed a little bit in the aftermath of Hurricanes Matthew and Hurricane Florence. Because what the folks, particularly in eastern North Carolina, saw was when housing stock is destroyed and people are displaced, when you don't have any more housing stock and it's not of any kind of quality, where on earth do you put people, right? There's no place to put, and for some folks, smaller towns, who lost significant housing stock, folks left because their house was destroyed. And if they don't come back in 6 months, those folks are gone. And for communities like Fairbluff, or smaller communities, they know that you lose 600 people in your town, that might be the end of your town, right? And so it's become an issue that is, that combined with, and to the earlier conversation about companies, we've had a number of western North Carolina counties make significant economic development investments in attracting companies. And then they get there and realize our workers can't live here because the housing stock is just poor. They live 3 counties over and commute in, and they lost all that tax base they spent all the money trying to bring to the county in the first place. And so increasingly it's becoming clear that although housing is privately held, it really is public infrastructure. We rely on it because as soon as you move, someone else moves in, right? It's a big piece of our community, the housing stock that we have. And so making an investment in that is critical to attracting economic development. It's critical to keeping your folks, making sure they have the chance to move up the income ladder. It's a critical piece of communities across the state, whether you're in rural North Carolina or urban North Carolina.
I hesitate to even take the microphone because I'm a healthcare person, not a housing person and not a politician. I have lived in Chapel Hill for 20 years and paid taxes here for 20 years. And as a private citizen, my views do not necessarily represent UNC Healthcare, but it feels like in the last several years there's been an element of magical thinking to some of the town leadership and town council in thinking that we can keep every single tree and every single bird and keep the rural buffer and not have high-rise development and have affordable housing. And again, this isn't my field of expertise, but it seems like there's too many variables that you're trying to pin in that single equation, and that if you were willing to give on any couple, you might be able to get affordable housing, but with all of those constraints in place, it just doesn't seem realistic that we will have affordable housing. And I think to compound that, the town has made it so hard for developers that even very well-intentioned, the only people, I don't know if this is right or wrong factually, but when I walked down Franklin Street, again, 20 years ago, Franklin Street was a very different place. It was smaller buildings, it was individual shops, it was that. Now we have Target. And it seems to me like the reason we have Target is that only Target can afford the armada of lawyers and armada of development people to get through the town's process to build anything. And so when you pull all of those things together in a very geographically confined space, which again is rigidly defined by this rural buffer, I don't know how you get any affordable housing of any meaningful quantity and quality in that context. My views are only mine.
So I'm gonna go a little general with this answer. This is something that I do say a lot. Whenever I'm speaking to politicians, I just simply say, I bring all this back to say, it's not them, it's us. Because in many cases when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking and legislating about them. Right? We don't really in many cases look at it as, no, you know something, it's us. Because it's also about that school teacher. It's also about that policeman. It's affordable housing as we've seen the rise of real estate values continuing to go up. And if you don't see the wages go along with it, what was affordable housing for some has now changed. It's in us, and it involves more people today as we continue to try to redefine it, and that in many cases we've ever really given it credit to. So how do we actually go through and say, yes, this is us and this is how we define it today, and let's do the math right now. And let's show everyone that is really impacted, because in many cases it was not who you thought. when we can break some of those myths, break some of those stereotypes, all of a sudden now you're seeing hopefully a clearer picture of how you truly impact us. Everyone in this room, because somebody is impacted. The majority of us are impacted one way or another right now. One way or another, and that's not the general thinking when it comes to, even as you talk about the term gentrification, which many people don't want to talk about. But even as you go to that point, it's still saying, wait a minute, I know people that has different types of incomes, and it affected them too. Generally, that's how I would say, that's how I try to attack it, to at least bring more people to more of a realistic definition as to how we're going to attack it.
Do you have further questions?
Yeah. So I know that the panelists join me in congratulating all that Habitat for Humanity, Orange County, and Jennifer and her team does to help create housing, a place for I'm sure many people on a waiting list, and slowly but surely you're taking through it, and so we really appreciate all the work that you do. Thank you so much. We do have time for questions. This is the one and only roving microphone, so who's our microphone runner? Okay, does anybody have a question?
You hear talk about people, I forget what they call these generations and everything, but going more towards renting now, and I don't know whether that's a short-term thing or long-term, but how, if it is long-term, people are more going towards renting as opposed to homeowning, how will that help, hurt, that thing about affordable housing?
Who wants to take that one?
You're not taking it? Defer to my colleagues who know something about housing.
I can answer as the
You can start,
HBA. I run the Home Builders Association, and we just look at a lot of data about millennials and whatever
They ruin everything.
Yeah. I think that millennials are buying now, and so that is happening. There is an uptick on millennials buying, but they're they have very specific wants. They want smaller homes, but with better technology, walkability, flexibility, affordability. So I think that just anecdotally, you can't get those things, and if you can't get affordability, walkability, and the flexibility, you rent until you find it. And so they're not as, we understand that a home is an investment, but I think that they consider their quality of life an investment. And so if by renting, they have the quality of life that they choose to have, they choose that. And so I think that's what we've been seeing in terms of, not rushing to home ownership. They're also not rushing to get married. And it's because it's not a priority in their lives.
So I'm a millennial. And I'll say that, like I said, over the last half century and more, home ownership has been the key way that low and moderate income families have built wealth. That doesn't have to be the way it is. It's just been the way that our housing market has worked, right? And so I think a lot of the financial advice that my parents gave me is you want to get that 20% down payment, you build equity in your home, and that's going to be kind of your thing moving forward. And I think a lot of folks, especially those of us who lived through, we were coming out and looking for jobs right as the whole thing imploded, that we saw, actually, it can go south for you pretty quick, and that can impact your decisions for a decade and a half or more. And so, I think there's some trepidation out there. 30-year fixed, but 30 years, that's a lot of time to think in advance. Plus, you have to deal with these unexpected maybe there's a better way to think, because once again, a house isn't just an investment tool, it's where you live. A lot more happens than investing. And so I think we're locked into thinking about our cities and our towns a certain way because that's the way they developed. But it's not necessarily the way it has to be, right? I own right now. I like owning, but I would like to not drive to Raleigh from Durham every day. I would like to be closer, and so my wife and I have been considering, maybe we go back to renting at some point. I think it does change the market. I don't, it's not a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe for the way we've set up business, but business responds because, that's what it does. So that's a roundabout way of saying that I think the main thing I want to get out there is homeownership has been seen as this investment thing for a long time. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be that, right? And I think a lot of folks in our generation have seen how it can be a catastrophe for you as well. And so we're a little bit more trepidatious.
Well, I also think it adds to affordable housing because many of the millennials can't afford to live there either.
Yeah.
Right? To go back to the us definition of what we talked about, the millennials are also part of that same percentage of people that we honestly don't talk about enough, that also cannot necessarily live where they work. And in many of these, probably especially when we talk about the downtown revitalizations and really move, actually it's interesting because one of the people that you really want, you want millennials, because that's where the play comes in, right? So you really want to, but if they cannot afford to live there, now we have to get into who's buying. Now there's become into a demand standpoint, right? So because you're not going to build unless you hope someone's going to buy. So if it's not that segment, then hopefully you got to go out and get some investor, somebody somewhere that's now able to buy that. Or if it doesn't buy, what normally happens, values come down. Right? So, I mean, there are some basic parts to that I think definitely affects affordable housing that we simply don't talk about in a larger framework of defining it.
Let's go all the way to the back row. He had his hand up, and then we'll come back to you.
So I have a two-part question. You guys can bear with me. I have a little bit of a preamble here. Yeah, maybe a little bit of a Jim, relax. So following up on the comments that you guys made earlier about place matters and talent, like I personally think in the country right now, San Francisco is probably the poster child of that. And even here locally, Chapel Hill to an extent. But where there is opportunity, most of the land is zoned single-family residential, and you can't just build, as you guys mentioned, the army of lawyers for Target. So how do you address the fact that fundamentally it's a supply and demand issue? And how do you get the town or city on board to allow for upzoning, or even to basically address the NIMBYism that occurs around development to increase supply overall to address that issue and create more affordable housing? And then secondly, just kind of as a tangential question, Minneapolis recently banned single-family zoning going forward in the city. And we'd just like the panel's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was hoping we were gonna get to that. Yeah, I'll take that one. So, I think so what Minneapolis did was they eliminated single-family only zoning, right? So you can't just say, we can only have single-family houses in this area, which is awesome. I'm excited to see what that does, right? And folks at State of Oregon did it well, statewide. Durham just voted in their expanding housing choices policy to do that in the urban tier for Durham. So they eliminated single-family only zoning in the urban tier, as well as allowed for accessory dwelling units and so on and so forth. Part of this is addressing the problem that really we have two kinds of properties now. We've got single-family homes and we've got multifamily homes that are apartment buildings, right? And you can rent some single-family homes, but essentially we have two products now. Whereas for most of the history that you've had rooming houses and duplexes and triplex, there's a whole host of different housing options that just don't exist anymore because we've zoned them away. And there's a history to that. A lot of us, because we've grown up with this type of zoning and this type of housing, this is the way it always has to be, but it's not the way that it always was. And part of that movement in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis was a recognition that the history of single-family zoning itself was as a tool to prevent people of color from moving into a neighborhood. We've heard, there's for Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. If you haven't read it, required reading for anyone doing any thinking about this. But it was a book that was built off of an article written in the aftermath of Ferguson, right? Ferguson, Missouri, that tracked the history of federal housing policy onto the St. Louis metropolitan area. It is a fascinating long read, and it is well worth your time. And what was interesting to me, even as a housing advocate and someone who talks about this a lot, I didn't realize a lot of our Supreme Court cases around race and housing came out of the St. Louis metropolitan area, right? Ending race-based covenants in housing, that came out of St. Louis metropolitan area. This decision around, it was called Blackjack, was the name of the suburb. It was a white suburb, and there was a Methodist and a Presbyterian partnership to build multifamily housing out there for people of color moving out of public housing in downtown St. Louis. The town, it wasn't even a town at the time, it was just an unincorporated area. They incorporated overnight and zoned the whole thing for single family to keep them out. That's the history of single family zoning, right? And so that's kind of at the heart of this, right? What you talked about, not as the official position of UNC, right? That when you're trying to limit height and keep the rural set, all of these things, when you're growing, density is the only way to get any kind of affordability. That's the only possibility. It's a numbers game, because what you talked about, taking it out to a 30,000 foot view, how much do you make? How much does your housing cost? It's a very simple math problem. And we'll talk to home builders. You put home builders, either single family or multifamily developers in a room, and you say, all right, I've got a family that makes $30,000 a year. Let's build a house that is affordable for that. They cannot make the math work. It is not possible. And so you reach, the incomes will go lower, but the housing costs only go to a certain point, right? And density is one way to get there. I'm excited to see what happens in Minneapolis as a result. I'm excited to see what happens in downtown Durham as a result of the passage of recent policies. Yeah, so I'm excited about that and hopeful.
Thank you. And I've enjoyed the discussion about the questions and answers. My question is probably for you, Samuel, because it's probably about more housing advocacy. As I really sit and unpack this, I tend to think, especially the economic mobility piece, we're putting a lot of eggs in the basket of affordable housing as maybe the prime fuel for economic mobility. When I think about people more in the 40s, 50s, and myself the 60s, well, we graduated college without debt. We had living wages.
Yeah.
So I would think that the housing advocates nationally know, do you feel the burden of, well, where's the advocates for free college? If we really were concerned, affordable housing should happen, no question about it. We should increase the stock, we should change the equation. The doctor's personal opinion is in line with my personal opinion. And I've lived in the Carborough Chapel community since 1992.
Yeah.
But when it really comes to affordable housing as a given, but really thinking about economic mobility and, quite frankly, maintaining our stature in the global future economy, I imagine, what's the thoughts around for anybody, maybe particularly for a housing advocate and policy community, what about the other engines on the train? Are there other ones besides free college education or true living wages? We know that our median wages are flat since basically the early 70s. We're getting to the 50th anniversary of flat real wages and increased debt. That's got to be more than a burden that solving affordable housing problems is going to solve, I would guess, in terms of economic mobility.
Yeah. So I think you hit the nail on the head in the question that, once again, going back to, it's a very simple equation. How much money do you make? How much is your housing cost? You can move either or both of those levers and get to affordability, right? I think back to my time at an organization, well, how do I say this? Well, when I was at Habitat before, a Habitat affiliate not to be named. There was a partner not to be named who found out, they were excited to build a home, and they found out that the family that they had been matched with worked at their company. They got really excited, and they developed this whole marketing campaign and got people out to build alongside there. And then at some point, someone finally woke up and said, you're putting an ad out there that says, come work for us, you're not going to be able to afford a home on the market, right? That was the ad that they were putting out. Because I think you're right, like wages are a big, big part of that. So that's the challenge in that, I think, is when you get to the lowest incomes, right? There will always be a need for housing subsidy, particularly for folks at the lowest end, because of the reality of development costs, land costs, increasing labor costs, which we could spend a whole other thing on labor shortages right now. The average age of plumbers and carpenters and electricians is in the 60s at the moment, right? And folks aren't cycling into the trades in the same way, which is creating, I mean, a lot of the folks who do construction work in my membership, and I'm sure in yours as well, we get entire construction crews stolen off build sites because someone down the road's offering better. And one of the things that we do at our organization is we lead the housing recovery support function of the state's disaster recovery task force. So we're working on figuring out where all the disaster recovery money is going and how we're going to spend it, and policy recommendations to weather future disasters better. And communities all across Eastern North Carolina are having problems rebuilding because they can't find anyone to actually do the rebuilding, right? And so there's challenges across the economy. So when you talk about millennials and home ownership, student debt is a big part of that. That's a big part of my story as well. Home ownership delayed into mid-30s because of it, right? And all of it's connected. And so as a housing advocate, I spend a lot of time talking about housing stock, and particularly making housing affordable for folks at the very lowest incomes, because there's some subsidy needed to get down there. But we also spend a lot of time talking about consumer financial protections, talking about wages and things like that. We do a lot of work that isn't necessarily policy related, but also working with companies to think about living wage for their employees. We've done a lot of studies with town councils, surveying their city employees, town employees. Are the wages you're offering enough for them to live in the town they work for? Which in most cases the answer is no. So it is a holistic picture. And there's, like I said, when I was talking about the place-based initiatives, breaking out of silos is hard. There's a reason we're in silos, because if you're doing X, all the stuff you have to do to accomplish X is really hard and complicated. And you get really annoyed when someone makes you think about Y as well, right? But that thinking and that organizing and that work is needed because it's all connected.
This is an area where I think really large employers can and should play a role as well. And so, hospitals and health systems are interesting organisms in that if you look at the sort of salary tables for our organization, you start out at $15 an hour. That's the lowest wage in the organization. We can talk about whether that is a living wage or not a living wage, but that's the lowest. But what's interesting about healthcare is that you can start at $15 an hour and go all the way to a multi-$100,000 a year physician and never once have a skip in the salary table. So every single economic level, from lowest wage earner to highest wage earner in the economy, is represented within a single company. And so one of the things that we've gotten very serious in doing in the last several years is investing in our employees and setting up programs so that people can come in the front door as a food service worker, as a housekeeper, something like that, work their way up perhaps through the supervisory managerial chain in their department, and then we can prepare them so that they can then shift over into like a clinic administrative role, something like that. And you have people not infrequently who go from being a food service, somebody serving trays in the inpatient unit, and in 5 or 10 years they've got a very solid manager job in a department that has nothing to do with that. And that's an area where I think increasing investment, of course, number one, it builds an engaged and retained workforce, which is our principal business interest in it. But it's also a way that we and that large employers can contribute to firing up some additional engines in that economic train and providing more actual wealth into the employee population as opposed to just focusing on the affordability of the housing per se.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Just really quick, there is an inability to be able to see the whole picture and to see how things connect. In many cases, sometimes it's an inability, sometimes it's a want. Right, I think at times there's too much, any accountants in the room? Okay, great. So, there's what I call the zero-sum accounting mentality that basically feels like, I can't do this unless I do this. Like, I can't have these different things affected. So I can't see the fact that this student loan piece is actually tied to any way to this affordable housing piece. I simply can't see it. What I can see is how I can make enough money doing it with student loans. How you are able to get rid of that zero-sum mentality and be able to look at things holistically gives you a little bit more of a picture, because now you can see the different levers, right? You can see how everything moves and affect the other if we're saying the center of this. Now, because we're talking affordable housing, it's the center where we go back to this is simply the financial stability of the family, of the individual. And all these other things are impacted, and how do you move those?
So I think, should we wrap or we take one more question?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to make this the last question. I will say, and because then I'm going to let the last question sort of end the program, we're probably all preaching to the choir, but I think to connect the dots and to allow someone to see the forest through the trees is we all need to be sharing stories about how all of these things intersect and affect housing and economic mobility, and I'll end there.
Just one quick question. We talk about the millennials. Habitat has started looking at the seniors. So what is the plan in place? Because people are living longer.
Yeah.
And needing places to stay. They're on a fixed income. They don't have a wage. They're on a fixed income. So what's the plan in place for us long livers?
Long livers, and you're living longer, right?
Yes.
We're all living a little bit longer.
So it's economic stability and housing affordability. Who wants to take that? Doc?
I'll say that, one of the things the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency does is they have money to essentially modify a home for aging in place, right? And you think about what it takes to put in a ramp and some handles in a restroom and in a bathroom, and the ability to extend the life of a home for a family that already owns their home, which not prevents, but keeps them from having to add nursing home costs for 4 to 6 years, right? Those are high impact, very small investments that are needed. The low-income housing tax credit, which is the main producer of rental units in the country, there are senior-only properties. But the reality is we got a big wave of folks that are in houses that are way too big for them now, that their families are and that balance, I think everyone is trying to figure out how to make that work right now. There are programs here and there. There are things that are targeted towards seniors, and by that it's 55 and up. So if that makes any of y'all feel bad, that's not my definition. That's someone else's. Senior properties.
I can speak to that a bit too. And we missed you on Monday, Samuel, but on Monday, Congressman Price actually held a roundtable discussion on senior housing here in Chapel Hill. There's a new senior housing development, Greenfield Place, that was developed by DHIC, and then Habitat was there partly because of our work in Crescent Magnolia where we're building senior housing, but also because of the repair work that we do. And there were probably a dozen people around the table, and this exact issue came up. And so Congressman Price is really looking at what are the barriers that we see. Obviously, we know the statistics about people who are aging, but what are the barriers that we see right now from a funding or policy standpoint that we could look into? And I know his team, he had his staffers there and really wanting to listen to the people who are on the ground doing the work, looking at the need for seniors and how we might begin to address it. So some really great conversations. One in particular, we talked a lot about the HUD 202 funding and increasing that funding, which has been, I think, maybe even for the past decade or more, we haven't seen a lot of that funding. It's not something Habitat would benefit from because it's mostly multifamily building, but that's one thing that he was really pushing, that they're starting to, I think, accept more of these projects in the coming years and trying to increase that funding again. So I think it is on the radar, but I think this is a good sort of exclamation point even to the conversation as we talk about connecting the dots and how housing really is connected to economic mobility and education and healthcare. If you look at our national discussion right now, and we still have yet to have one presidential debate where housing is discussed, there are a lot of other things that are being talked about, but housing still has not come up. And so that's part of why we wanted to have this conversation around the importance of housing and really how housing is the key and home is the key. And it's beyond the four walls of a home. It's all of these other impacts on someone's life that then if you could figure out a way to decrease the number of people in our country who are burdened by their housing costs, who are making these decisions between where do I live that far out, increasing transportation costs, do I pay for my medicine, can I afford to put my child into soccer, those types of things. If we could figure out how to do that, then we could create a more stable environment for people to be able to climb the economic ladder. So that's one of the things that we're talking about. I'm so glad that you're here. One thing I wanted to mention about these series is that for me, and the first one was in September, I've had already dozens of conversations in the community about the topics that have come up. And so I want to thank our panelists and thank our moderator for the content and know that the conversation that we had, I know I will leave this room and I will continue talking about it and continue advocating for this kind of conversation to keep happening, for us to break down our silos maybe a little bit further, and I hope that you all will continue to do the same. So please thank our guests tonight for joining us and sharing their expertise. And I also want to thank our Keenan Flagler Business School students who this is partly their idea and their work. You can see they're running up the microphones and fixing things and working on the bar. And so really helping us on the logistics of making this happen. This is the final one. And again, I think this is going to continue to pay forward as we keep these conversations going. So thank you so much for all your work. And we have the room for a bit more. I know there's a basketball game on, but if you have additional questions, if we can stay around for a few more minutes, then we'd love to keep chatting with you. Otherwise, we'll send you the link via email. And if you're interested, I'll include some of the work from Rod Shetty that we mentioned a couple times. If you're not familiar with that, it's really, really interesting. So I'll send that and maybe some of the other resources we talked about. Thank you.